Alright, so this one's going to be kind of a quick one, but I want to talk about sort of the experiential side of system design. So, what this sort of means is how a system feels to play through it, and sort of working backwards from a design perspective, what do you want a player to feel, and how do you build a system that creates those feelings? Probably the most obvious example I can think of is when you have a new player playing a game, and then as they progress, they're going to go from like the early game to the mid game to the late game. And building a system that allows a player to sort of get in there and figure things out is really good. I guess probably the core example I'm going to run with is sort of Dungeons and Dragons. Because in first level Dungeons and Dragons, you have one hit dice. So that means you have basically one die of health per se. So if you have a d6 or like a six-sided die as your health die, like you have 6 HP. And if you're wondering how much damage weapons do, they also deal the amount of a die. So you have weapons that deal 1d6 damage. So pretty much if you get hit twice, you're kind of gonna die. This is a really big problem because the first few levels of Dungeons and Dragons feel like really dangerous. Like any bit of extra damage or extra health or extra anything that you get is really going to matter a lot. But later in the game, when you have like 150 HP and you're rolling like 66, six-sided dice, if you will, if you're rolling like a handful of dice every time to deal damage, all the numbers kind of blend together or average out, and it just isn't doesn't feel that impactful anymore. And it actually takes like the combat just kind of grinds down and takes longer. And it's kind of weird that it happens that way because from my thought as a sort of experienced system design sort of perspective that I'm taking, you'd kind of want the opposite. So what I mean by that is when you have a new player coming into your game, they do not have experience with your game. They may be experienced in the genre, they may know some of the conventions, but they don't know exactly how your game works. They still have to learn things. And honestly, they may make like reasonably intelligent decisions, but they can still make stupid decisions. Whereas someone who's coming into your game, from the early game as well, could be I'm going to call them a replayer, someone who's played the game for a second time or something, maybe fourth time, fifth time, right? They know where things are going, and they just came out of, if they just finished the game, right? They just came out of a very, like, the most complicated version of your experience. So when you're thinking about how a player is going to experience your game, especially in the early game, you have a lot going on in your head. And you have to kind of compensate. Like, you have these new players who have the least amount of knowledge. So what that means is you want to, let them recover from their mistakes. You have to understand the level up investments that they're making could be mistakes, or they should be like mitigate. You should be able to mitigate like the issues that could come from that. You want to mitigate any sort of gameplay mistakes, and you have to remember, like to them, everything is new. So the complexity of the game itself doesn't need to fully be there. It's just, hey, like we're just going to show you the basics, and you're still learning like all this new stuff as you sort of get into it. But for a replayer, if you ease them in too slow, that can be great for a new player. But the replayer coming in there is going to get frustrated. They're going to get bored, and they're going to like abandon their playthrough, their second playthrough. Before they've even gotten out of the early game. They haven't even really played the game twice at that point, right? You want to allow that experience to still be good. So you want to be giving them ways for them to be clever and show how they can demonstrate, mastery. And this is the time when you would give them like items or like little things that they can maybe use in unexpected ways. And then you just want to make sure you give them the ability to like get through the content quickly so they can get to the mid game and start doing more interesting things. And really that's what the mid game is about. The mid game is about showing, the interesting moments in your game and also kind of taking those training wheels off, kind of showing sort of the problems and stuff that players are going to have to deal with and have them, really kind of work with some of the like combat puzzles and stuff that you have. Like this is going to be kind of, I don't want to say where the game is most interesting, but it's where you get to explore the most about the game systems themselves, because this is the point too when you actually are making decisions about what you have and what you're not going to have. and you're not just going to have everything and be able to like destroy everything because you're in the mid game. You're not supposed to be that powerful yet, and that kind of leads into like what the late game is going to be. And I feel like the late game, you kind of have two choices here. You can kind of make it a victory lap where like everything's kind of paying off and you kind of are doing your best stuff. And in some ways, like the gameplay is going to speed up really fast. But I also think you can kind of go a little bit in the other direction, and instead of you still keep things fast, but things just start to get more lethal. They just start like the power curve just goes up to the point where you just can't make mistakes anymore because yes, you're so powerful, but so are your enemies. Like you've gotten ahead of the damage curve, and suddenly you're just wiping things out. And just sort of to recap that whole thing I just went through. Like the early game is all about kind of slowing the play down, and then in the mid game it's sort of like trying to keep it at that like normal amount of gameplay speed. And at the late game you're trying to speed it up and like let people just get through the content, and in some ways sort of reward their feelings, or reward their feelings, reward their work that they put into the game. You kind of want to make it pay off. And like I do sort of want to say like it doesn't just extend to this like one thing about like, hey, how do you want the leveling up to feel and how do you want that to translate to the gameplay. So I guess like another example of the way this could work is you want to think about how players are going to experience your systems. And even on a more like micro level, one of the things I was thinking about was you have concepts such as buffs and debuffs and healing and all of these sort of valves that are used. In gameplay, they're either called like levers or valves, but they're like things you do to like pull the strings, if you will, on the player's experience. There's certain like rules you don't want to break, but there's also certain things you have to allow the player to do. Like one thought about around like health or healing or something like that, maybe certain status effects can only be healed over time. You have, for every point of like poison you receive, it takes I don't know, a few seconds or like a minute or something for that to go down. A minute would probably be pretty extreme, but let's just say like 10 seconds. You have 1 point of poison. If you've accumulated 1 point of poison, it slowly starts to go down. If you are like a healer or something, you may want to have the ability to like just directly reduce poison. That might seem like a really great idea. But the problem is now you're kind of breaking that rule about poison always goes down slowly. One of the things you could do is you could say instead you just get either like a resistance to poison, or you make it so that the effects of poison are just greatly reduced. So let's say like the poisoned effect deals like 1% per point of poison damage like over time. So you need like 100 poison points essentially before it starts dealing you enough damage to really be noticeable. If you were like this healer type, what if I just give you a buff that makes it so instead of needing like 100 points of poison damage, you need like 1,000 points of poison damage. So you're taking basically zero damage over time, or just so little damage that you will have enough time to wait out the effect based on like the duration of this buff. And so in that sort of way, you can see other different ways of achieving the same goal by using numbers and using systems to sort of craft a very specific kind of experience, and to say like, if you're poisoned, like that person, they know they have to keep this buff on. And they still know they have to like wait and have this amount of time where they're, in this sort of state. So that can be really helpful like for a designer or for someone who's trying to like understand the timing of things. I did another Tomcast about sort of how important timing is in games. But I mean, this is just another way of seeing like, hey, how can numbers work, and the mistake they make when they're designing a game system is they'll come up and they'll be like, oh, this is this really cool idea that I have. And it might be a really cool idea, but the problem with a really cool idea is that it might be interesting in your head to like work on and kind of work with it, but it may not actually create something new for the player to experience. When you really think about it, you kind of want to work backwards. You want to be like, well, I need to deliver a particular play experience. How do I get numbers that do that? How do I create, a system that does that? okay, so I'll put it this way. Like, there's a lot of RPGs out there, and they all have, 6 to 9, or I guess I'd say maybe like 3 to 9 stats. They all still feel the same, though. Like, there's nothing majorly different about them. Probably the biggest thing you're doing is either choosing choosing to roll under or over or a dice pool. And this is essentially games doing the same things and not like they still know what sort of experience they're trying to deliver, and they're making very deliberate choices about not necessarily having an interesting like dice rolling experience, but in trying to deliver an interesting feeling from that dice rolling, from even very like mundane, very tried and true dice rolling experiences. So I'm trying to think of like a good way to end this, but I guess in the spirit of things, I should just keep it simple because it's all about the experience of it ending and not necessarily how I do it.